This hearing is called to order. This morning, we welcome Administrator Craig Fugate to discuss the fiscal year 2015 budget request. Administrator, thank you for joining us. Over the last few years, FEMA has worked to rebuild the devastated communities and to rebuild itself. Administrator Fugate, this committee has a strong history of responding to your agency's needs by providing the funding that was so desperately needed to rebuild and reorganize FEMA in the post-Katrina era. We will continue to do so, but that funding will not be a blank check, as you well know. Administrator Fugate, before we begin, I want to touch briefly on several issues which we will discuss at length later in the hearing. With respect to disaster funding, do you have what you need to continue the relief and recovery from today's disasters and those disasters that will occur tomorrow? To lower costs and speed up recovery, Congress provided additional authorities to FEMA last year. How are they being implemented and how will they save money in the future? With respect to grants, your FY15 budget again includes a proposal to reform FEMA's grant structure, a proposal that we have seen before and have denied the request of the authorizers. This year, FEMA has finally submitted the denied the request of our authorizers. This year, FEMA has finally submitted the associated legislative proposal to the Appropriate Authorizing Committee. Why do we need a new grant program, and what are the challenges ahead to obtain authorization? Mr. Fugate, these are issues with which you are very familiar. We look forward to hearing from you and getting your thoughts on these challenges. Administrator, your written statement will be placed in the record, so I ask you to take 5 minutes to summarize it. But first, I'd like to recognize Mr. Price, our distinguished ranking member and former chairman, for his opening remarks.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Administrator Fugate, thank you for joining us this morning to discuss FEMA's proposed budget for fiscal year 2015. Your tenure has been a very, very busy one, particularly in 2011, which brought a record high 99 major disaster declarations, along with 29 emergency declarations and 114 fire management assistance declarations. That was also a record level. Since 2011, we've seen an additional 109 major declarations, including, of course, Superstorm Sandy in 2012, the biggest test of FEMA's capabilities since Hurricane Katrina in 2005. I also want to express my sympathies to the families affected by the devastating mudslides in Washington State. These mudslides have now claimed 24 lives. They continue to pose unique dangers to those undertaking research efforts. FEMA personnel have once again responded quickly to this disaster and are working diligently with first responders in Washington under extremely difficult circumstances. We commend them and you for your efforts. Mr. Administrator, by almost all accounts, FEMA has performed admirably under your leadership and has been there for the American people in every one of these disasters. As an agency, FEMA has had its ups and downs over the years, but it seems clear to me that you and your team are doing something right. So we commend you for that. We thank you for your continued leadership. The budget request for FEMA is $10.4 billion, including $6.4 billion for major disasters under the Budget Control Act cap adjustment. Excluding this major disaster funding, the request totals $3.97 billion, $384.6 million, or 8.8% below the current year level. Much of that cut, I was disappointed again to see, is attributable to a $223 million reduction in state and local discretionary grants. The cut's almost $300 million, or nearly 20%, when considering both discretionary grants and training grants. Now, I recognize that the President's Opportunity Growth and Security Initiative proposes additional funding for FEMA grants, and I support that initiative, which shows what the House could do if Republicans were willing to just close a few tax loopholes. But that isn't the same as including the funding in FEMA's base budget request, nor is there any chance of its implementation prior to our subcommittee mark being produced. This cut to grant funding is once again paired with a proposal to consolidate the discretionary grant programs into a single national preparedness grant program. As you know, stakeholder groups have had serious concerns about this approach, some of which you can perhaps address today. But I do want to credit you for submitting authorizing legislation for the program this year, something that's been missing from the prior versions of this proposal. We need to better understand the implications of the restructuring of these grants. This proposal does more than just change the structure of the programs themselves. It could change the entire dynamic of who gets funding, how funding is dispersed, what activities become eligible. I continue to have concerns about how this approach will work in practice. Would we risk pitting governors against mayors, for example, or state capitals against their most populous cities? Answers to these questions still need further development. I look forward to being able to get into that further this morning. I must also register my misgivings about the number of cities that are being funded through UASI in fiscal 14. This number of these cities has been unexpectedly increased by 56%. To do that, and then at the same time to propose a 2015 budget that cuts $300 million in funding, seems incongruous. I thought we'd reached a consensus that this program should concentrate on urban areas that face the highest terrorism risk and not be used to spread the wealth around. So I'm having trouble understanding why we seem to be backsliding on what's perhaps our most highly focused program by reverting to a broad dispersal of funding. I also want to express concern about the proposed cut to the Emergency Food and Shelter Program, along with the proposal to transfer this funding and the administrative responsibility for the program to the Department of Housing and Urban Development. The budget also includes what's now a familiar proposal to eliminate the pre-disaster mitigation program. I acknowledge here too the pre-disaster mitigation is included in the OGSI, but that really doesn't mitigate the lack of funding in the base budget. So, Administrator Fugate, I want to thank you again for your service to for the country, the decisive leadership you've offered, the way you have turned this agency around. You're a great public servant, and we appreciate that service. We have some important things to discuss this morning about how you can even do your job better, and we look forward to that discussion.
Thank you, Mr. Price. We're ready to hear your statement.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman, Ranking Member Price, and other members of the committee. You got my written statement, and I thought I would start out with something probably a little bit different. Instead of advocating for my budget, I wanted to thank you for a budget. You know, I took a lot of courses in high school as a kid I didn't know was ever going to pay off, but probably one of the most important ones was civics. And understanding the roles and responsibilities of how the government works, the separation of powers between the executive, legislative, and judiciary. But I've been here since 2009, and the struggles of going through uncertainty and not having a budget has added to the workload and complexity of trying to do our mission. I know that in today's time, this has not been an easy task. But being in normal order, where we have the opportunity to present our budget, you deliberate, you appropriate, gives us the certainty to be able to execute our mission that we've not had. I know it was a challenge, but I needed to make that thanks, because being in normal order, having a budget, as much as people maybe outside of Washington don't understand what that means, for the people that have to then implement the people's work, given the funds that Congress provides, the certainty of a budget and the ability to execute our missions are key. And so I always welcome the opportunity to present a budget. I always relish the opportunity to discuss the budget and understand this is a process we go through. But I really want to thank the Appropriations, your staff, and you for giving us a budget and getting it through very difficult times, and know that those times continue. But it is an important part of how our government works. And that appropriations process is not something I look at lightly, and I think it's probably one of the foundations of how we ensure that the people's work gets done. So with that, I would close my opening statement, Mr. Chairman, and I welcome the questions.
Well, thank you. We do strive for regular order around here. It's sometimes difficult, but we're pretty happy about what happened last year anyway. Okay, my first question, several bills have been introduced in recent months regarding how we fund wildfire suppression. with some interesting, some are interesting that we use current disaster cap adjustments to fund firefighting, and others suggesting that FEMA fund fire suppression efforts. Can you address what FEMA can and can't do under existing authorities, and where is the line between federal and state responsibilities? Mr. Administrator, we like solutions instead of people just stating problems. What do you see as the solution to this costly issue?
Well, when we talk about wildfires, we break it into two distinct categories. Those that occur on federal lands, which are the responsibility of the federal government, and these are traditionally those budgets for the Department of Interior and U.S. Department of Agriculture to fight those fires. We also look at the fires that occur on state and private lands. And FEMA does have a program under the Disaster Relief Fund to administer those. We call those Fire Management Assistant Grants, that when fires exceed the capabilities and the financial thresholds that are established for states, they have responsibility for average wildfire seasons. But when it's an extraordinary season, just like we do for other disasters, we provide matching funds for them to respond and do mitigation in those disasters. The challenge has been, because the DRF is set up as a unique instrument to fund disasters, within the federal wildfire community, they have another funding mechanism of the FLAME Act. But the challenge has been when the FLAME Act has exhausted its funds, and because it is not something that they are able to go above their top line in the budget, they end up having to take money out of existing programs that would have mitigated or managed the forest and hopefully reduced future fire loss. So they're oftentimes, in fighting these extraordinary wildfire seasons, having to cannibalize their budgets to fight the fires instead of maintaining the health of the forest. So we end up oftentimes paying twice. What if we could provide a steady source of funding for wildland firefighting and understand that it's going to vary wildly year to year, just like we know other disasters do, so that they had the ability to fund the wildfire activities without having to go into their base budget and take away from their maintenance and preventions. So we look at this separation of the DRF focused on the wildland firefighting in the communities and the states, and the federal wildfire activities and the funds they need. And oftentimes these fires are occurring simultaneously, where we have federal wildland firefighters and state and locals fighting the same fire, but the funding's based upon which geographical area you have responsibility. So we very much support this idea that the FLAME Act be given some way to be budgeted in such a way that, just like the DRF, it would not have a year-end. It would be continuous funding and would allow some variability between the severity of wildfire seasons without it necessarily threatening the top line of the budget for those existing agencies.
So you feel like the fix is in the Fire Act?
I look at the Fire Act because it's focused on the federal firefighting mission that, just as you recognize with the DRF as an appropriator, it's oftentimes difficult to balance the Sandys and other storms in those types of budget environments with your top line budget. So if we were trying to fund Sandy in the top line, it would literally cause huge disruptions throughout the budgeting process. But because of the budget stabilization agreement, where it's above the top line and there's an agreement on how high that can go, it gives the flexibility to absorb a disaster like a Sandy without it necessarily getting into the day-to-day operation of your various agencies you're responsible for. Configuring the FLAME Act similarly, I think, would give that stability to have the funds available and the cap to deal with the catastrophic fire seasons, but give some certainty to the budget process for the day-to-day operations of the U.S. Forest Service and Department of Interior.
Okay, thank you. That kind of leads into the next question I have. Since Sandy struck the East Coast on October of 2012, FEMA has been working tirelessly to help New York and New Jersey area recover from devastating impact of the hurricane and the associated flooding, spending in excess of $7.2 billion to date to facilitate these efforts. How is the recovery progressing, and what are the long poles in the tent? What steps has FEMA taken to address corrective actions identified in the Sandy After Action Report from this past July? While in New York last year, we visited several hospitals and schools that were severely impacted. What is the status of getting the hospitals fully operational and mitigated against future threats? And what about the schools in the impacted areas?
Mr. Chairman, for the record, I'd like to submit you an update on all those items. But in general, we are utilizing the tools that you gave us, not only in the supplemental, but also in the Sandy Recovery Improvement Act, to speed up the process of funding some of these large, complex projects. Previously, we are still, in many cases, actively paying for recovery operations and rebuilding from Katrina. And we didn't want to repeat that. So we wanted to, and you provided us the tools, to begin upfront funding of some of these large, complex projects so we can complete the funding at the beginning of a project rather than waiting for the lifespan of the project and all of the costs associated with managing that. We have some very large projects that are nearing completion that will take advantage of that, but it also is the ability of the DRF to support those activities. So I'll provide in writing a list and update of those, but I think we're making good progress on getting these projects approved. You hit one key area, though, that we are really focused on, and that is mitigation. When we deal with these structures, I want to make sure we build them, not just for what happened, but to make the investments so that we're not having to come back again for the next disaster. So we are spending a little bit more time making sure that we're not just mitigating oftentimes based upon past history or past events, but really looking at what's the likelihood of events that could disrupt this facility and making decisions about the function it provides, less about what maybe just a building cost would be.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Administrator, I want to thank you for the statement you just made about the appropriations process. I think it's not only appropriate, but very helpful in the political context in which we're operating here. I think you'll find on this subcommittee, on both sides of the aisle, very strong believers in that appropriations process. We believe that no matter who the president is or what the party division is, that appropriations is the key congressional function. It's right there in the Constitution, and historically it's proved to be so, that the power of the purse is the key power that we hold. And that power is most effectively exercised when it isn't overrun by partisanship and ideology, but where there's a cooperative process here and a determination to hold the executive accountable and to work with agency heads like yourself in understanding our needs, understanding the kind of budget that we should be writing for the public's benefit. So that's a process that we're hoping to bring back, because it has not fared well in recent years. Our House has become much more divided in partisan terms, much more polarized. And there have been some real costs for that. I mean, not only is bipartisanship more difficult on bills that have formerly been bipartisan, but it's also almost made appropriations impossible. I mean, we had a budget last year that we literally could not write bills to because it was an ideological budget written with no eye to political reality. So appropriations broke down in the face of that. So now we have a budget agreement. The budget agreement avoids sequestration, avoids the unrealistic funding levels of sequestration. It avoids another government shutdown. Now, the funding levels are inadequate in many cases, especially for the major domestic bills. And ironically, the main drivers of the deficit, namely tax expenditures and entitlement spending, are still unaddressed. But still, this budget agreement gives us 18 months of a respite from this lurching from crisis to crisis. And that's what you're talking about, as I understand you, here this morning. It's good to have that 18 months of relative normalcy. You've helped us appreciate from your standpoint the importance of that, and I hope we can deliver on that and can deliver a bill this year, even though it won't be to everyone's liking. We'll still give some degree of certainty and let you plan and let you execute your job the way you need to do. You're again proposing to establish a National Preparedness Grant Program, which will take the place of 4 programs, the State Homeland Security Grant Program, the Urban Area Security Initiative, the Port Program, and the Rail and Transit Program. As I said in my opening statement, I want to give you a chance to elaborate on the structure and rationale of that proposal. It appears to focus more on cross-jurisdictional efforts, to indeed require cross-jurisdictional efforts to address the full range of Homeland Security requirements, but you can think of many regions with multiple players, like New York City or Washington, D.C., and I wonder how you think the way disasters are planned for and handled in those areas like that would be changing or evolving under this NPGB structure. Have changes been made in the structure? You've been proposing this, of course, for some time. Have you responded in some ways to the criticisms and concerns expressed by stakeholders? Were the NPGP to be authorized and funded, do you think we'd see a significantly different balance of investments as we've seen under the currently funded preparedness grant programs? After all, those programs are there for a purpose. They're there to focus on ports, to focus on rail and transit, to give a minimum allocation to each state to deal with security issues, and then to have a highly targeted effort aimed at these urban areas. Those aren't all the same thing, and to consolidate them, what difference is it going to make in terms of how we fund programs and the activities that are supported by funding? That's probably enough in the way of leading questions to let you elaborate on the rationale for this proposal.
Thank you, Congressman Price. The efforts to consolidate the grants into one and to administer the grants through the states, it goes back to, again, our Constitution divided the powers between the federal government, the state, and the people. And one of the challenges as a state person, the urban security areas were not originally part of the Homeland Security funding after 9/11. They were created afterwards. And as a state, I've worked at local, state, and federal government now. When you fund the municipalities directly, those municipalities derive all of their authorities, all of their powers, and their existence from the state constitution. And each state constitution is different. And who and how and where powers are applied and the authorities of the governor, the authority of local officials varies. In the state of Texas, county judges are chief executives and have very strong powers, in some cases equal to or greater than the governor's powers. That's determined by the state of Texas Constitution. When we go directly to cities and we fund the cities, we are bypassing the state constitutional authorities. And the basis of this has always been those events that we would much rather focus on preventing. And if we can't prevent, would be so catastrophic as a nation, we have to have the capability to respond to them. That response model is based upon the state constitution powers and authorities. And what we have said is by bringing these grants together is not to take money away from jurisdictions, but to focus on how that state, those local communities need to be one team. When you fund them individually, we're not going to have a team that we would have if we put them together. Some states have been much more successful in building that capability, but I wanted to focus on what are the needs of the nation? What are the threats to the nation as a whole? How best identify those capabilities, and where do we have shortfalls, and how do we prioritize that? This is not to take money away from ports or transit. This is not to take monies away from cities. In fact, I would like to see and want to work with the authorizers to add strength to a collaborative process where no one part of the state or local or any other group is not part of the decision-making process. But I also want to recognize that each state's constitution is different, how they are organized and the powers they have are different. And again, we have pre-existing and long-standing challenges from the city hall to the courthouse to the state house. But when a disaster strikes, it will be under that state constitution, those authorities, and how that response will be carried out. And if that disaster exceeds the capability of that single jurisdiction, the rest of that state, the neighboring states, the federal government, and as a nation, we have to be prepared to respond. So these grant and the proposal to consolidate is not about taking away funding from anybody. It's about focusing on the existing structures that you'd have to utilize in these types of responses.
Mr. Chairman, I know my time's expired. We'll return to this. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. I promised Mr. Kingston, he's got a conflict. He came in and talked about it earlier, so Mr. Kingston.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman and Mr. Director. It's with great pleasure that he jumps over Tom Lathan to give time to me. But I was here, Mr. Latham. I just want, and all the other committee members. I represent the entire coast of Georgia, and as you know, coastal regions have had a lot of heartache about bigger waters, and one of the big concerns was that FEMA bypassed a study before implementing it in its former form, the feasibility study, and we've been told because FEMA didn't have the money, but when that became the case, what was done to signal that red flag?
Well, first of all, when you read the statute, there's no linkage between the affordability study and moving towards actuarially sound rates. They were not coupled. Normally, if you would have legislation that said you will do affordability study and then from that you will perform certain tasks, this was actually written as a separate section and was not coupled to. The statute actually required us, particularly for businesses and Secretary of Homes, to eliminate the subsidies and phase those out in a very short period of time. And to begin the same thing for permanent residents when there was a change, either you sold it or you had a map change. And those were very specific line items in the statute that weren't coupled to the affordability study. The affordability study also was unique in that it had a cap on the amount of funding that was permitted, which dictated what you could do to the degree of how much you're funding, which is not uncommon, but in this case, not having a feasibility of what a study would require and then putting a budget cap on it. When we went to the National Academy to begin talking about doing an affordability study, their immediate response back was, based upon your funding and timelines, we could not do that study. We reported that back to the committee staff that based upon that initial amount of funding, that as we approached national academies, they did not feel they could complete that study in time. So
let me move on with a little, but there is similar language in the current rewrite. Is that sufficient? Are you saying that's decoupled also, or what about the current?
The current actually was based upon our input, and I think this is a funding amount that, based upon our discussion with national academies, will begin the study and hopefully provide us the tools. But it is, again, this time we had more input into that process and bringing back what we had found and what a study would require in the time frames. And so we think that what's in the language is what we'll need to be able to do that job.
Okay, a question in terms of the actuarial soundness of it. How confident are you that the actuarial rates are really sound and credible? Because in our coastal area of Georgia, we've had very little flooding. In fact, I don't remember in my lifetime, and by the way, I have an insurance background, so it was something I was be aware of prior to coming here. But we have had a number of floods on riverside property in the interior of the state and elsewhere around the country. And so the concept of a 100-year flood map seems arbitrary to me. Why not an 80-year? Why not a 103-year? And so to me, representing homeowners on the coast who haven't had a flood and they're looking 200 miles away at somebody who has a house by a river that's had 2 or 3 floods, but one's paying the high rate.
Well, my question would be, if the risk is not that bad, why the commercial sector won't write that policy? Why does the federal government have to? I would also go back to your hurricane history. The Sea Islands and Jekyll Island in particular have been very fortunate that throughout most of the 20th and 21st century, you've only been brushed or not had direct hits. You go back into the late 1880s, that area was devastated. And one of the challenges with coastal is you don't tend to have as many frequent events, but the events you do have tend to be very large and produce the very large numbers of policies being claimed. So the 1% risk, again, is a 1% per annum, not over a 100-year period. It's the risk that we set that said once your risk is at a 1%, it would no longer be a preferred risk that you would have if you were elevated. And again, in these coastal communities, you know the homes are very high up. If you're 1 foot above base flood elevation, you're still getting the preferred risk. It's when you're not built to the elevations and you're below that the risk increases. But my challenge has been, as much as we fault this program, the reason there is a program is because the private sector will not put capital in the flood zones. And even though there haven't been frequent events, I still question, if it's not a high risk, why doesn't the private sector offer competitive priced insurance?
Well, my experience with the property companies is that they will cede any risk possible if they're socially able to do so. Case in point, during the 1970s when there were riots and they were redlining certain properties in the inner city, there was a big social pushback, said, no, you can't do that, and then they actually stayed in there, and their presence helped underwrite burglar alarms and so forth, just as their presence here could actually help underwrite better structure, better building, and so forth. So, in my opinion, the state governments, which, as you know, are the primary regulator, have given these insurance companies maybe too quick of a pass. And when we talk about floods going back to the 1890s, insurance still is, despite all the science, it's still a gamble. And it would appear to me if you push them, you need to get in there and have a certain percentage of the coastal business if you're going to write property and casualty insurance in a state. And I think that we could push that side of it a little more, but the end results would be, I think, better structures and probably better actuarial tables.
I agree. I think my experience has been capital type approaches, of using a capitalist approach, does a much better job of managing this type of a risk than a federal program that is trying to, not with the financial tools that you would have in the private sector, manage a sole risk and only manage the highest risk of those types of properties. I think capitalist systems actually do a better job of pricing risk appropriately so we build and grow our communities in ways that are sustainable.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Director.
Thank you.
Mr. Cuellar.
Chairman, thank you. Thank you and the ranking member for holding this meeting. Mr. Fugate, it's always good to see you. And again, I appreciate your state experience coming up here to Washington. I appreciate what your men and women do. A couple of things. One, just to direct your attention that under the last appropriation bill, this omnibus bill that we passed, appropriation bill, we added language for the first time that links your performance measures to your funding requests. As you know, in Florida, y'all been doing that for a long time, Texas and other places. So one is I direct your attention to that particular provision, number one, where they focus on the performance measures that should examine outcome measures, output measures, efficiency measures, and customer services as all defined under the GIPRA law that we passed in 2010. I've looked at your performance measures, and I think out of some of the other agencies under Homeland, you all do pretty good, but I would still ask you to categorize them under that area. And one example also is there was a GAO report that came out in June of 2013, and they focused on the performance measures of the federal grants to state and local governments. I think in 2010 we had $545 billion, and if we provide $545 billion, how do you measure the effectiveness, the efficiency, et cetera, the outcome measures from the $545 billion that we gave to the states and to the local governments? So I would ask you to address that issue. The second issue I would ask you is the process of the ongoing issue of flood mapping and revising flood maps, and specifically, I know I had called your office on the Laredo area. I hate to be so local, but I'm asking because they've talked to me about it. So I would ask you, one, on the performance measures and specifically the issue of the $545 billion on state grants, and of course the mapping issue. And you don't need to answer that on the Laredo area, but if you can have your staff specifically give us a 1, 2, 3 how we start addressing that issue at the Laredo area.
Yes, sir. We'll have our flood mitigation administrator get back with you on that. We have spent a lot of money as a nation on terrorist preparedness, prevention. We have been working, in fact, it's a little bit late, but we're still going through our clearance process, our National Preparedness Report. And I remember when I first met with you in the first hearings, you were very much wanting to draw, we're investing, what are we getting? Is it the right things? Is it being maintained? Is it effective? Are there things we're funding we shouldn't be funding? We've been working diligently to take that guidance and tie that back to national capabilities. We first had to start out with asking the question, what do we have to respond to? Because if you don't have the top benchmark, you're hoping you build up to what could happen. So we looked at a lot of scenarios, and we basically came up with what's the maximum credible threats this nation faces. In fact, the President talked about it in his trip to Europe. an improvised nuclear device detonated in a major metropolitan area, with the associated fatalities, injuries, and the catastrophic damages not only to the community, but also the strategic impacts to the nation, financial centers, commerce, transportation, other avenues that could be impacted by that. And so we're using these very large, complex scenarios to drive what have we built with the funds, where are the gaps, and what do we need to maintain to be able to address these catastrophic threats to the nation. So out of that 31 capabilities, where we map that now back to the investment strategies, and again, part of the consolidation of the grants into one grant versus being bifurcated into different grants is to better drive that agenda of making sure we're investing not just what jurisdictions have identified their needs and not taking away from that, but also making sure we're making investments for the national preparedness and capability to respond, as well as remembering the key part of all this is prevention. To have an attack occur oftentimes is, unthinkable that we would have to respond to that. So the focus on things like fusion centers and better tools to allow law enforcement to stop or identify or deter threats, both those that are domestically generated as well as foreign, are keys to being able to make sure we can respond to the threats daily.
So, Mr. Chairman, and I'm going to yield back some of my time, Mr. Chairman, but I do have to say this, that we're hoping if I can work with the Chairman and the Ranking Member on some language to further make sure we focus on those measures of the output, outcome, performance, and customer service. Members, I don't know if you've had an opportunity to look at government, the performance.gov, and of all the agencies under the Homeland, I would venture to say that Mr. Fugate and his people probably have the best performance measures where they're more results-oriented. Mr. Chairman, Ranking Member, if you remember this point under terrorism, we spend billions of dollars on terrorism, so their number one measure is, are you satisfied with the intelligence report that we give our stakeholders, instead of saying how many terrorist acts did we stop? I mean, that's the oriented, but they've gone off on that. But I would venture to say that of all the agencies under Homeland, this gentleman and his staff probably have done the better job on that. We still have to do a little bit more, and we'll be happy to work with you as a committee, but I have to say they've done a good job. Thank you, Mr. Fugate. I yield back the balance of my time, Mr. Chairman.
Mr. Latham.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, and welcome, Mr. Fugate. I would echo, I think, the fact that you have done a great job, and we appreciate your efforts, and your agency, your department is there in a time of a lot of people in a very have great needs, and your ability to respond is extremely important. It's not without some problems, obviously. One of those goes back to 4 days in April of 2013. We had severe ice storms in Iowa and elsewhere in the Midwest, and it caused millions of dollars of damage to the electric utility lines. Project worksheets were prepared for emergency and permanent repairs. The worksheets were prepared under the guidelines in the FEMA Electric Utility Repair Fact Sheet for public and private nonprofit entities. That's quite a title for, anyway, that's the guidelines. Its applicants were denied disaster assistance based on concerns related to the so-called comprehensive laboratory testing. In December of 2013, the denial was appealed. And according to knowledgeable officials, the lab testing in this situation would be harmful to the system's integrity and would have significantly impacted the rates the citizens in rural areas pay for their electricity. The requested disaster assistance in this instance pertains to damages that are nearly identical, and this is very important, to caused in other states by the same ice storms. Yet the Iowa utilities are being asked to provide material that appeared not to be relevant or necessary, and in unusually large volumes. I think their one submission was 10,000 pages, and there's more to come. Can you tell me why this is the case, why I was being treated different? If you cannot, and you need to go back and review the matter, I would like a substantive justification provided for this record, and also on a separate justification for my office. In your response, I would also like to know how the treatment of Iowa claims by FEMA compares to other states' treatment in their almost identical damage claims. Or in other words, I want to know what the policy requirements for assistance are being interpreted, if they are being interpreted in the same fashion across different regions. I would also caution you in your response that we already have some pretty good information from other states as to how they're being treated.
I do know of the situation. The governor brought it to my attention at the governor's meeting with the president. I do know it's under appeal. Beth Freeman, who's our regional administrator, has this. As we go through the appeal process, she'll be the initial determination there. And I would agree with you. I would like to make sure that we are consistent in our findings. I also do have the due diligence requirement to make sure that we are dealing with those funds which are appropriate, that are caused by the storm, and reimburse those damages. If it's eligible, my process has always been it's eligible. I don't try to look at how to use the system to reduce cost. I find that's not productive, and that's not what you designed the system for. So we have the responsibility to do due diligence. I can't speak to the specifics because I have not seen this appeal. I know that it's with the regional administrator. We will provide your responses back to you as we are putting that information in a timely fashion. But I would agree with you that if we are not treating those electrical co-ops equally as other jurisdictions are treated, that is a cause of concern, and we will address that. But as the appeal process is going through, I would not be able to prejudge that, as I have not been given that information as with the regional administrator.
Okay. I'd also like in your response to include assurances that FEMA did not change policy without adequate notification of the, and public input according to the Stafford Act. And finally, I'll just have to tell you, there's some concern on the part of those who are dealing with this situation in Iowa, that a temporary FEMA employee or a FEMA contractor, whichever it is handling the Iowa portion of the workload from this ice storm, and that the individual has been apparently very, very difficult to work with. And I hope it's not the case, but I want you to look into it sooner rather than later and report back to me your findings, and not in just a pro forma manner, if you would.
Will do, Congressman. Again, my responsibility to the taxpayers, if it's eligible, it's eligible. But I also want to make sure that what we approve does not result in de-obligations later. And your state has unfortunately seen where the IGs come in and found potential cause for de-obligations. I want to get the right answer the first time. And I think this one got off track, so I have a lot of confidence in Beth Freeman, my regional administrator, to address this. And we will respond back to you. And if we do find there's cause here, we will take action.
Okay. Well, there is obviously a real concern that right across the state lines they're being treated entirely different than what they are in Iowa. And that's pretty clear. Okay. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Mr. Owens?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Mr. Fugate, for coming today. I'd like to direct your attention to page 12 of your written testimony. In particular, the area that deals with the recommendations of the OIG regarding your technology structure. One of the things that concerns me is that it appears that it says you do not have, in effect, the systems in place that allow you to assess your inventory and, in effect, respond to disasters in as timely a manner as you might like. Is that an accurate portrayal in your view?
The technology does not keep us from doing that. The technology, though, does not keep up with us in some cases. The technology has never delayed our response. We put our stuff on the road and move quickly. What we are looking at is how do you manage, and particularly the more large-scale disasters, of keeping track of everything and having more resolution on product. What this would really do is help us have to send fewer things. In many cases, we are over-responding because we don't have the fidelity to be able to do a just-in-time system. And to be quite honest with you, in the initial response to disaster, we're always going to push heavier than even what the systems may suggest, because in disasters, the fluid and the ability to make quick decisions are time-based, and if you're not moving, you're not there. But the systems are really designed to help us better manage that once we reach a stable point, to ensure that we're not doing what we saw in previous disasters, where weeks into it we're still ordering stuff and building up huge inventories that are no longer needed, that we can better tie consumption rate to delivery rates. So in the initial response, that's not the issue. Where it really is after 3 or 4 days, and we now see consumption coming down, we want to be able to make sure that, okay, well, we're cutting the orders. We're not bringing in more stuff. And having that ability to manage that once we're stable is where I really want to drive cost savings. Because I think once we're stable, we have to have a better feedback. If we see consumption dropping on things, why are we still ordering stuff week 2 like we were day 1? There's an entire difference. So it's not that it delays us, but it doesn't give us the fidelity to tie in consumption once we get to a stable point in the disaster and begin slowing down or stopping additional supplies coming in, additional purchasing, and having a better feedback loop that's faster to gearing down once we reach that stability. But the technology itself, although it's an important tool, we use a lot of times brute force to get things moving and will not use that as an impediment to respond.
Is this it sounds like it's potentially a software issue. In other words, as you're getting data, as the data is changing, you can't upload the data quickly enough to give the decision makers the ability to analyze the data?
I would even say, again, a lot of people start with software. I'm still working on making sure that we have the processes in place, that once we have that process, the software can be designed to support that. So we have different systems, one piece that's tracking inventory. We have another software where we're actually placing our orders and tracking that. But oftentimes the consumption in the field, what's actually being handed out. You know, when you deal with major corporations, they have permanent footprints and they know where their stores are to know their customers. They can tell you when you take 1 bottle of water out of that store that they need to ship 1 bottle of water. That doesn't exist in the disasters, and we're not trying to build that. But what we are trying to do is make sure that we have better resolution on things moving into an area. We have better resolution on what the demand is, and when we see that our supplies have met demand, and that demand is now tapering, which usually is tied very much to power coming back on, we gear down so we save money in the long run by not continuing to push in what we started off with. So these linkages are the things we're talking about. But another part of this is making sure these systems are secure. Because when you look at these systems, I think we've oftentimes looked at IT security after the fact, and we're trying to build that on the front end. Because these systems all tie back into a lot of networks that touch a lot of parts of the federal government. And so we're also wanting to focus on making sure that we build IT security in our systems, but we want to make sure we're automating the right process, not just automating and hoping it works.
I'd like to switch gears to another subject. Been a lot of conversation over the last approximately a year about the movement of oil by rail car. What assistance are you providing to states and local governments in terms of creating plans to deal with a potential derailment and oil spill?
Well, I think this is starting to show up in 2 areas. One is training. And again, recently, this week, we had testimony from our Center for Domestic Preparedness that as we identify emerging threats, we start looking at what the training needs for the first responders are going to be. This is also something that will start showing up in our threat and hazard identification, the what we call THIRAs, where we work with the states on what are your threats and the fact threats aren't stationary. You know, the primary regulation of the oil trains is the Federal Department of Transportation. And we've had a long history as a first responder and a local and state person of working with them on other hazardous materials that move across. But I think this is relatively a new emerging threat. We never saw this much fuel oil being moved by trains. And as we identify that, it will come back to where's the appropriate place to build this into plans, what kind of additional responsibilities and planning requirements are there. We have a lot of history doing this through EPA's Superfund programs for extremely hazardous substances, which are fixed-based. And we have a lot of history working the transportation pipelines and other issues, primarily through our Department of Transportation working with their counterparts of the state. So the 2 pieces to us we see is this something that we need to begin incorporating into our basic planning documents for communities to consider in their planning? And 2, the training requirements that may impact National Fire Academy and the Center for Domestic Preparedness as either addendums to courses or perhaps even courses specifically built around how you would respond to that.
There seems to be, at least in my communities, a growing recognition that this is an issue, and they're searching for the kinds of information that will address the issues you just talked about.
Well, our subject matter expert for this is the U.S. Department of Transportation. They're the ones that would be best prepared to provide the guidance of how to respond in those issues. But we look at things that this committee provides, like the Emergency Management Preparedness Grant Funds that goes out to communities, both to the state and locals, to do all hazard planning. We provide a lot of those guidance tools under that. So it would again be something we fund all hazards. Sometimes emerging hazards come about, but there are mechanisms in place to tie that to. As you're pointing out, a lot of times it is, what is the information we need to have? What do we need to look at in our plans? Are there additional training requirements? Not necessarily we have to have new funding, but we need to incorporate our existing tools and adapt to that threat.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Morning, Mr. Fugate. Just a couple things. As you know, we earlier this month we passed the new legislation rolling back many of the reforms of the Bigger Waters flood insurance program in 2013. What are the impacts of this new legislation, and when will policyholders see changes mandated by the bill?
Well, the bill gave us some timelines. Probably the one that will take the longest, but it will be a significant financial piece, will be the reimbursement of already collected premiums. We have timeframes in the bill to accomplish that. But most immediately, we think there are some things that we are working diligently on to implement now that the President signed it into law. The first one is right now is to transfer to preferred risk when you sell your home. This has been a huge issue that's raised by both homeowners and realtors, that they could not go to closing when a person was buying a new home and they went to a full actuarially based rate that was far greater than what they thought when they were purchasing the house. So the bill does provide now the transfer of those grandfathered rates to a new buyer, where the previous legislation did not allow that. That is something that we are working on, and again, our time frames are based upon our analysis of the bill and implementation. But we are working to get this out to all of our write-your-own policy companies that write the policies, so that we can recognize that that grandfathered rate is now transferable to a new buyer. That's one of the most immediate things that we're looking at. In addition to, we have to set the new rates and actuarial tables. That's going to take time. So we're kind of looking at this. First thing is, let's get the transfer of the grandfathered rates in place. Let's look at what it's going to take to do the refunds and get the refunds. You have given us timelines to do that. And let's look at the new actuarial tables we have to build to then calculate the 18% increases that were allowed under that statute.
Thank you. Also, in the aftermath of Hurricane Sandy, the President established the Hurricane Sandy Rebuilding Task Force and named Secretary HUD as the head of the effort. Administrator Fugate, how will the findings of the task force change how FEMA works with communities to respond and recover from these types of disasters?
Well, it's not going to really change much how we work. It was what this whole idea was. We have a collection of federal agencies that all have programs that apply to disaster response. And that the larger the disaster, more important it was for those other agencies to understand what FEMA was doing and where the gaps were. So this is less about how FEMA is changing as doing a better job of bringing all of our federal resources together so communities are looking at rebuilding. You know, we literally deal with what was damaged and what was there before. We don't do a lot of things about what the future needs were or what pre-existing conditions, but HUD, Army Corps of Engineers, and other authorities do. So we think that from the standpoint of being able to bring all of the federal programs together and look at problems holistically, not just what the Stafford Act would be able to do, but what would other programs be able to do. We are going to build communities back for the future and address issues that the Stafford Act was never designed to. So we think it's been an effective tool. We have some good examples of some things, one of which was consolidating, which the statute required, all of the environmental historical reviews across all the agencies. As it was, as a state or local, if I was funding a project with HUD dollars, FEMA dollars, Army Corps dollars, I could find myself having to do 3 separate environmental and historical reviews, even though it was the same project, because they all had different rules around their monies. We've been able to bring that together and simplify that process so that one environmental and historical review satisfies all of the federal funding requirements for a project.
And, do you see any potential changes in the roles and responsibilities in the National Disaster Recovery Framework as a result of findings of the task force?
Again, when we were initially considering this, there was some question as to the lead agency, whether it would be FEMA or HUD. A decision was made at that time to be FEMA. We are comfortable in that role. But I think probably what we're seeing is this is actually expanding beyond Stafford Act disaster declaration. I don't know if many people know this, But agriculture used the National Disaster Recovery Framework in the Midwest during the droughts because it, again, gave them a tool that they did not have. They don't normally have those day-to-day relationships with a lot of different agencies that do disasters, like Small Business Administration, Commerce, Economic Development. And so they were able to utilize the same framework for a drought, which was not a Stafford Act response. But it is, again, bring the agencies together. Because as a state person, I hated to have to go through the grants catalog to figure out what agencies had what programs to help me. And so bringing this together means we bring all our resources, we sit down, look at the issues, go which agencies are best able to do that, and provide the state and the local communities a better unity of what the federal agencies are capable of doing versus having to go one by one to figure out what's going on.
Thank you. I'll yield back at this time, Mr. Chairman.
We're joined by our distinguished ranking member of the whole committee, Ms. Lowy. I saw her on the elevator. She's been a busy lady today. So welcome, Ms. Lowy.
I think there are 4 or 5 hearings this morning, so I apologize for being late, and I thank you very much, Administrator Fugate, for all you're doing and for joining us today. Before I begin my questions, I'd like to take a moment just to thank you again for your work in helping New York recover from Superstorm Sandy. The storm damaged over 305,000 homes in New York alone, devastated businesses, crippled infrastructure along the East Coast, and without your work, many would still be without homes. I thank you, and I look forward to discussing this in detail in a moment. The explanatory statement accompanying the fiscal year 2014 omnibus included language directing the department to focus the Urban Area Security Initiative UASI program on urban areas that are subject to the greatest terrorism risk and allocate resources in proportion to the risk. The purpose of this language was to focus the resources of the department and FEMA in those areas at the highest risk of an event where it matters most, rather than spread this money around to regions facing substantially lower risk. When Secretary Johnson testified 2 weeks ago, I asked him about the FY 2014 allocation. He gave the impression that the list of UASI eligible regions would be decreased. That afternoon, we learned that the list of regions had actually increased. Why did FEMA decide to increase the number of UASI eligible regions, which was not consistent with legislative intent?
Previously, you'd given us a hard cap of 25 jurisdictions. And when we do the formulas, and again, this is, part of the direction is from the 9/11 Act and the direction of Congress is to do risk-based. We look at populations, we look at intelligence of threat, we look at critical infrastructure, and we look at a variety of factors, and we develop formulas that we then apply. And we're actually required to look at the 100 large metropolitan areas as the target area. Not that they would all get funding, but that is the initial group that we're to look at. We develop formulas based upon all of those factors, including input from intelligence and analysis as DHS on threat, current threat, and sometimes that threat changes. We look at special events, venues, populations, military bases, and others, and we calculate a formula. When you gave us 25, we ran the formula, and when you got to 25, it stopped. But when you run the formula without a cap, and you look at particularly those cities that went down to, I believe now 39, they're very closely grouped. There's no clean break there. And so when we ran the formulas, it's very obvious, the New York City, Boston, LA, these top tiers that have always been in those top tiers. But when you run a formula and you don't put a hard cap on it, you now get into an area where there is no clear distinctions. And so they're grouping pretty much is how that recommendation came together. So it wasn't the intention that we wanted to expand the groups, but once you got down into the middle of the 20s, there's not a lot of distinction. And so where do you make the cut? And so we proposed back to the Secretary that many of these jurisdictions had received previous funding. They had exhausted those fundings. There was capabilities that had been built around that funding, and that with modest funds. And again, we did not extrapolate out the funds by population, and we actually funded those larger jurisdictions at a higher level. But when we got down to the lower levels, we felt that based upon that formula, since there was no clear break, and we had seen various activities and various incidents occur, that modest investments in those cities would maintain capabilities that had already been paid for. But the problem was, if you do a formula base, you do get to those areas where there is not a clean break. When you gave us a hard number, it was pretty easy. You went through that formula, and what was 26, no matter how close they were to 25, didn't get funded.
Okay, let me ask you one other question about the Hazard Mitigation Grant Program. I've heard from several municipalities of delays in processing Hazard Mitigation Grant Program applications. For example, the village of West Haverstraw has a drainage problem caused by flooding in one of their main streets. The village submitted an application in December, is waiting for an outcome. Officials in New York State say they do not have a time frame. This becomes more serious as a heavily trafficked road is starting to cave in as a result of the repetitive flooding. If the village fixes the problem today, that they will not be reimbursed for the work, and yet if they wait, they're playing with fire. Could you tell me what steps is FEMA taking to more quickly move the Hazard Mitigation Grant Program application reviews along, and what advice do you have for municipalities? Wait?
Well, as a state and local, one of the challenges were if you begin construction and before you have an approved project, it's not eligible. So we always fought that battle of timeliness. The other problem has been we've oftentimes built mitigation as after the disaster response was completed or nearly completed. And that means that these projects would normally not even be talking about 3 or 4 years later from the time of disaster. But you're right. If you don't make your mitigation investments early in that response, we may lose opportunities. So we've been working to give more tools and more focus on mitigation pretty much from the time we get to a stabilized point and not wait till all the rebuilding is started, because we know that there are some projects that need to get started earlier. So we work with the states. I will take this back to our region. Jerome Hatfield, who's the regional administrator from New Jersey, he knows the region pretty good, and he's a big fan of mitigation, just like I am. And we want to look at this, and again, I'll find out about this project, report back to your staff where we're at on that. But we recognize that. But traditionally, it was almost the cycle was you did response, you did rebuilding, and then you did mitigation. And that takes too long. So we're trying to go, when we're rebuilding is when you need to be thinking about mitigation, not years later when we missed that opportunity.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Ms. Lowy. On that task force you were talking about, I'm glad to hear that you feel something constructive came out of it, because your agency paid $8 million for it, and so that the HUD folks could put on a show, and I'm glad it turned out to be worthy. Just a question to make sure that I've got this clear. It's kind of repetitive a little bit. We budgeted $7 billion to fund known disaster requirements, including new events. And we have to keep back to the kind of the 800-pound gorilla that's sitting in the room, and that's Hurricane Sandy. Is this sufficient funding to address Sandy needs as well as ongoing disaster requirements, including projections?
Yes, sir, Mr. Chairman. Based upon even the acceleration of very large projects, we started something early on, developing better spend plans of what we anticipate would be drawn down from all of our open disasters. Previously, we oftentimes had no real visibility and oftentimes would have to come back to Congress for supplementals outside of the normal budget order. But with the Budget Stabilization Act and funding and fully funding the DRF, and I've been here before where I've had to testify, where we weren't asking for full funding and the challenges that posed. But that full funding, what we calculate, Mr. Chairman, is what are our existing open disasters, what we expect in that fiscal year to be drawn down, including the acceleration of the projects from Sandy. So this is full accounting. This is not, we're not leaving anything out, full accounting. We look at our average disaster response. So last year we could respond to the floods in Colorado with no supplemental. It was actually built into the budget of what we're funded for, and maintain sufficient reserves to respond to the no-notice catastrophic disaster. Based upon all that, we will complete the fiscal year with sufficient funds not only to pay all the bills, not slow down any of the response that's ongoing, any of the recovery ongoing, with sufficient reserves to allow for the next event that may occur without warning.
Based on the last monthly report, the Disaster Relief Fund will carry over $4.7 billion. counting the $1 billion you set aside for the no-notice events, how will these funds be used in 15?
Again, based upon what we are working on with the projects, we are developing spend plans over what is still owed on disasters and getting those drawdowns. And again, based upon our look at what is currently out there in Sandy, we expect those drawdowns to continue into 15 and be rather substantial. I think initially when we saw Sandy, again, we knew we had a lot of response on the front end, but we're now getting into the rebuilding. That will be the largest tickets that come down. And unlike Katrina, where those bills kept coming and are still coming, our hope is to have these large projects identified, funded, and moving forward with some understanding of what the future demands are going to be versus almost, the previous example was almost like a blank check. You don't know when they're going to cash it. You don't know how much they're going to cash it for, and it's hard to do budgeting that way.
I get that. I get that. Shifting gears a little bit, Mr. Fugate, it has been mentioned to you by several members that the FY15 budget includes significant changes to FEMA grant programs. Of interest to me is creating a new training partnership grant program, which would in effect terminate the current National Domestic Preparedness Consortium program. These programs have been authorized by Congress and have conducted training at no cost in all 50 states, including training almost 2 million people. Under this new construct, what happens to the NDPC programs? And in the if the new programs are not authorized, what changes would you propose to address to any concerns that the administration may have with the existing programs?
Well, we're trying to move towards, we've got a lot of centers that were stood up in the aftermath of 9/11. Some of them are outstanding and were existing prior to 9/11 and are key parts of our training apparatus for our first responders in our local communities. What we're trying to move towards, Mr. Chairman, and we're willing to work, what we want to do is make sure that when we're investing in training institutions, we're getting our investment back and we are funding those that are providing the greatest capabilities. An example in your state, Texas Tech, or Texas A&M, has been doing fire training and engineering and search and rescue even prior to 9/11. So this isn't to break these relationships, but to better fund and identify those programs which are providing the services that our response communities say they need and is effective, and maybe not funding as much or continuing funding for programs that are not performing. But that's our goal, and we're wanting to work with you to make sure that we get an outcome, that what we pay for we get, and it's responsive to what the response community has indicated their needs are.
Very good, Mr. Price.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Administrator, I want to just briefly go back to the grants discussion we were having earlier, and then I want to give you a chance to talk about your strategic planning approach, which I know is a matter of considerable importance to you. In responding to my question about this recurring proposal for consolidating the grants program, you made a convincing case, I think, for coordination, also for recognizing the constitutional authority of the states. And you and I both come from states who have exemplified the assumption of responsibility. That's your background as an outstanding state administrator, and I've appreciated the work done in our state to have effective state administration. That isn't equally the case all over the country, but clearly a robust state role, a leading role for the states is clearly desirable. But I continue to think we should be somewhat careful what we ask for here. The present structure does guarantee that certain needs are addressed, and the criteria for allocating funds are not the same in each of these programs, as we said earlier. But it also contains some of the pressures. I guess I do want to ask you to reflect briefly on that. In your discussion with Ms. Lowy, you talked about the discussion, the distribution of these UWASI funds. There are pressures to distribute those funds widely, to dissipate those funds. There are pressures of all sorts that come to bear and will come to bear on these programs. And the division among these programs now does contain some of these pressures, gives you certain protections, I would think. I mean, you wouldn't want to see the kind of pressures that sometimes develop around UOSI funds. You wouldn't want to see them applying, would you, to the whole of the grants program? I mean, I'm just wary, perhaps, of unanticipated consequences that could come from this consolidation. We'll continue this discussion, of course, but if you have a quick response, I'd like to hear it.
Congressman Price, again, I have a responsibility to propose to you what I think would work and produce the desired results, but I've also been diligent in taking what we have been authorized and implementing it to the spirit of the law. So this is not a question that I would fight any decision you make, but it is more of looking at how we better build a system. And that's, again, why I think the appropriation process with the authorizing language gives us an opportunity. How do we best ensure that role that the state constitution dictates of how that state and those jurisdictions operate in a disaster are better tied to funding that are going to very specific programs? And again, we've had success. As you remember, we had many different grant programs. We're down to basically 3 large categories. So we have done consolidation, and it has been successful.
Yes, and as you'll recall, when I was chairman of this subcommittee, we took part in some of that consolidation. There were way too many grant programs, too much money being dissipated around. And so, yes, we did undertake a certain consolidation. I suppose the question is, what's the optimal point of consolidation? And that's something we'll continue to address. Related topic of strategic planning. You have been successful, I think, in large part because you have a very disciplined approach to defining your mission, assessing gaps in capabilities, developing approaches to fill those gaps. Sometimes strategic planning in some agencies isn't very closely connected to what's happening on the ground. It sometimes looks like a bureaucratic exercise, but I know that's not the case for you. You take this seriously. So I want to ask you what you're up to here. You developed last year an updated administrator's intent document for years 2015, 2019. I understand the agency will soon be publishing a new strategic plan for the years 14 to 18. These documents are focused on imperatives and priorities, objectives you hope to achieve over time. Just a couple of leading questions here. Can you give us a sense of where you think the agency is to where you think it needs to go, a kind of overall sense of that? You think the current strategic planning process is working as an effective tool? Is there good buy-in to that process for your employees? What success have you had developing performance measures and outcomes? Are you satisfied you're able to measure the extent to which you're achieving objectives? You satisfied that the 2015 budget request, and that, after all, is the product of several iterations among FEMA, the Department, OMB. Is that a good reflection of the requirements identified through your planning process? What kind of connection, in other words, has there been? I think it's fair to say this subcommittee is a strong supporter of effective strategic planning. It's something we want to see a lot more of. So is there anything we can do to help facilitate these efforts?
Well, the first thing is the budget is always a key part of that. And I'm not satisfied with where we need to be. But there are a couple things you did raise I want to highlight. My experience with strategic plans, they were a check-the-box document that somebody required, were written by a few people. They were produced, shown to the committee staff, box was checked, and somebody had a strategic plan. Yet all the other activities, including the budget, bore no reflection on that. Most strategic plans talk in very general terms. They don't get specific. I felt that without numbers and outcomes, a strategic plan was another one of these futile efforts of trying to bring management to government, yet it just created another process. So we took a different approach to it. And our strategic plan is, when you look at it, it's pretty much based around some of the things that we know we got to get better at. And we also knew that this could no longer be written by a couple of people and then it's the document of the agency. The agency had to be part of that. Staff had to be brought in. So we actually brought in folks outside of the traditional office that drafts a strategic plan to start fleshing out what do we mean by being survivor-centric. I mean, that's a nice term. It's like a marketing term. What does it really mean? Well, what I try to get everybody to understand and what our staff says, you know, when you apply for disaster assistance, you shouldn't require an instruction book on how to get help from FEMA. You got enough problems, but we make systems oftentimes that are easy for us to administer without understanding what does this mean for the person that needs the help. So how do we build systems around what the person, the family needs? Understanding we can't say yes to everything, and we're not going to be the answer to everything. But we should not be so complex that after somebody's lost their home or a loved one, that when they first come into FEMA, our response is you need to dial 1-800-621-FEMA, and that's the best we can do. And this means we have to change our attitudes and our programs. And so we picked 5 themes, very focused. It doesn't exclude everything else we do, but it's very key to changing these things across the agency and then measuring that change and then driving investment. And again, people tend to look at FEMA's budget because of the DRF is going, you have all this money. We operate in the salaries and expenses account, all of the day-to-day operations and the training and the preparedness of the permanent workforce to be ready to go. And so this strategic plan is really focused on those salaries and expenses, not the DRF. The other thing I want to close with, we had tended to, and you hear this term a lot, back office systems. You talk about HR, your human capital, you talk about your IT, and at FEMA, it was always second to the disaster response. And in many cases, we would bypass normal order to get things done at the detriment of building effective management structures. And in our strategic plan, we actually started out with 5 areas, and this was going to be a column over here, and I said, wait a minute. You know, that's part of the problem. We always treat this as something separate from the mission. But if you don't look at hiring through retirement and that workforce to support being focused on survivors, of being able to go into the field and operate in that environment, to be able to reduce risk and respond to catastrophic disasters, if you're not hiring that workforce, you can't accomplish that mission. So we took our little fancy chart and we took all those things that people used to call the back office and we put them at the bottom and said, this is FEMA's foundation. If you don't have the workforce to do the mission, you're going to fail. And that's from hiring to managing performance all the way through career development to retirement. If you don't build the IT infrastructure that's secure from the beginning, not bolted on or basically getting exemptions every day, you're going to fail your mission. So if you're going to respond to catastrophic disasters, if you're going to buy down future risk, if you're going to be able to operate in the field, not at 500 C Street where everything works there, but it doesn't work when you're out in a mudslide in Washington State with poor communications. And if you don't build your systems around the people you serve, not that it's easy for you to administer, but it makes sense to them, you're going to fail. But that doesn't work if you don't build that foundation. So this strategic plan is not a shelf document. We are linking it to our performance metrics, to our investments, and making determinations about resources within our budget that we have to allocate based upon accomplishing that mission.
Thank you, sir. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
At this time, I'd like to recognize the gentleman from Tennessee, Mr. Fleischman. 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Administrator, before I begin my questions today, sir, I wanted to extend to you and to FEMA a heartfelt thanks, not only for being here today, but more importantly, for all of your hard work in supporting our citizens and first responders. In recent years, the 3rd District of Tennessee, which I proudly represent, has been hit by severe storms, tornadoes, and floods. FEMA has done an incredible job in responding to these situations and helping us rebuild, sir. So thank you. In my home state, the Tennessee Emergency Management Agency also plays a vital role in preparing for and responding to these natural disasters. My questions for you today are about the Emergency Management Performance Grant Program. As you know, this program is the only source of federal funding provided directly to state and local governments for all functions which help rebuild a robust emergency management system, and it has a 50-50 cost share structure. Your FY15 budget proposes level funding for EMPG. Could you share with us today some of the benefits of this program and any ways you think it could be improved, sir?
Well, the Emergency Management Preparedness Grant Program is, again, a grant that is administered through the state, and how that funds are then allocated to the locals or something the states and the locals work through. But I think one of the key tenets is it is definitely a shared responsibility. It is a 50-50 match. Unlike any of the other grants we administer, this is a hard, you have to have a dollar for a dollar match. So it is a shared responsibility at local, state, and federal level to provide the capability to respond to disasters. And why this is a benefit to the federal taxpayer is the better capability of this shared responsibility we have at the state and local level, the more they can manage disasters on their own, therefore reducing the cost of the federal government, shortening the time of response and recovery, and making a better investment in making sure our communities are resilient. These dollars provide oftentimes the only way many jurisdictions could have staff devoted to emergency management. Usually with our fire, law enforcement, and others, without these funds, people are giving additional duties, but in many cases, this at least allows the fund partially or fully fund personnel at the local level, as well as additional folks for the state to build this capability for an all-hazards response.
Thank you, sir. One more question. We've heard concern about the definition of unit of local government in the MPGP proposal. Local government stakeholders are concerned that the definition would greatly expand the eligibility for the grant programs and could set a dangerous precedent for the expansion of the definition under other federal programs. What is the rationale for defining a unit of local government as you did in the proposal? And as a follow-up to that, is there any alternative way to define the universe of subgrantees you're trying to capture?
This goes back to not with the emergency management performance grants. It goes back to the authorizing language to consolidate the Homeland Security grants, the urban security area grants, and the port and transits. Because there are certain entities that receive funding under the Homeland Security grants that by the definition of the 911 legislation would not be included, such as nonprofit religious facilities, certain port authorities, which are not government entities. They would be excluded unless we put that change in there. So the change has not any application towards the emergency management preparedness grants of opening up that. It's to ensure that in our authorizing language of consolidating grants, we don't exclude current applicants that are eligible for funds under the 9/11 Act and those three grant funding streams. So the intention is not to expand it, but not to prejudge what a governor and a state legislature may do. Again, it is the state's decision about what they fund. I think a lot of times when local governments look at trying to protect their interests, they forget they operate with their authorities under the state constitution, and if the state determines that there may be entities that are not necessarily local governments, but are necessary for that state response, would you want to preclude them? Now, that's not being proposed, and not anything that we would do with that. But it is one of the questions when you do limit to only local forms of government, what if the state has structures that don't fit that?
Thank you, sir, and I will yield back.
This time I'd like to recognize the gentlelady from California, Ms. Roybal Allard, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I apologize for being late, but unfortunately my other subcommittee meets at the same time as this one. Director Fugate, as you know, California is in the midst of an unprecedented drought, and because of these extreme conditions, Governor Brown has declared a drought emergency, and officials in my home state are extremely concerned about massive wildfires this summer. I understand that FEMA is working very closely with Governor Brown's administration to prepare for a wildfire season, and in fact, California Secretary of the Office of Emergency Services, Mark Ghilarducci, has had high praise for FEMA's leadership, and I'd like to thank you for that. Can you please just give a brief update on your plans to combat wildfires in California this summer, and if any additional resources will be needed to adequately respond if the anticipated crisis becomes a reality?
Well, we've been working too close to the state of California. I'm quite disappointed with Mark and the governor for taking the regional administrator, Nancy Ward, away from me and hiring her as their deputy. So working close doesn't always work to our benefit some days. Again, in fully funding the disaster relief fund, our primary role in wildfire activities is supporting the extraordinary costs that occur on non-federal lands. So the primary tool we have are the fire management assistance grants. We had actually, prior to the season, early when I came on, was give administrators in the regions greater authority to issue those grant requests to be more timely to a governor's request. But the wildfires are a symptom of the drought. We're also working with the governor's task force on drought because there's other issues we're concerned about as well. But the other part of this is going to be able to ensure that our federal firefighting agencies, U.S. Forest Service and the Department of Interior, have the resources to fight the fires on the federal land. If an event did occur, though, in California that exceeded both the capabilities of the Fire Management Assistance Grants and we saw significant impacts, we also have the ability under Stafford Act at the governor's request to provide additional assistance. But everybody from NORTHCOM on down to the National Guard Bureau to all of the other agencies that would have a role in an escalation of wildfires are closely monitoring, working through our region with the state. And again, you have a very excellent deputy at the California Office of Emergency Services who is well familiar with the federal programs, and I think will be a tremendous boost to the state through this season's wildfire, much to my dismay.
Under the National Preparedness Grant Program that you propose in your budget, states would be required to submit a single consolidated statewide application to FEMA. However, I understand that port and transit authorities are concerned that their needs may be ignored under this plan and that their request for funding may not be included in the statewide application. And they're concerned that if that were to happen, that they have no recourse. So given the importance of our ports and if the National Preparedness Grant Program is implemented, would you consider creating some kind of an appeal process for port and transit authorities who believe that they have been unfairly ignored by their governments and yet feel that there is a very important need for funding to protect the ports and transit?
I would suggest that the way we look at that is how do we build in the authorizing language to support this. One of the things which we discussed briefly is to make sure that we don't exclude them because they don't always fall in the definition of local government under the 9/11 Act, and we want to make sure they're not excluded. So that's part of the language in the authorizing language. But the other piece of this is to go back to how do we build a collaborative process? Because quite honestly, I don't think that neither the state OES or Governor Brown are not going to look at the ports as critical facilities that need to be protected. But again, as you were talking about wildfires, it is ultimately Governor Brown's authorities under the Constitution to make these hard decisions about where to make the investments to best protect the state as a whole. So I would suggest we look at the authorizing language, and again, as Congressman Price and I discussed, is, we don't want to create unintended consequences, and our goals are the same. But can we address these concerns through authorization, or is it seen to be, that we need to keep these separate? And the other part about the ports and transits, we've been running those as competitive grants for the last couple of years. So it is not always going to be that they get funded. It's based upon input, and again, FEMA administers a grant. A lot of this input is actually from our subject matter experts. The captains of the port, the U.S. Coast Guard, have a lot of impact on these grants and these applications. So there is not only the state's responsibility, is the federal agencies that would have responsibility as well in identifying and ensuring that, such as ports, the captain of the port, that their recommendations are weighed in on funding needs.
Okay. So we will then look at the authorizing language and see if that can be addressed. As you know, cyber attacks are an increasing threat to our nation. And in response, the state of California is undertaking a groundbreaking cybersecurity initiative that could provide a model for states nationwide. Governor Brown and other state leaders are establishing a cybersecurity commission with state, local, and private industry stakeholders who will share best practices and work together to improve detection and response planning for cyber attacks. DHS grant funding will be critical in expanding this important initiative, and I was pleased to see that in your FY 2014 Homeland Security grant funding guidance that it provides a much more thorough explanation of eligible cybersecurity activities than the 2013. Given the seriousness of these potential cyber attacks, what role do you believe FEMA and FEMA grants will play in strengthening our nation's cyber defenses at the state and local level in the future?
Well, there's actually two pieces to that. The Homeland Security grants are administered by FEMA, but we are not always the agency that has the jurisdiction over the various threats. So when you talk about cyber, we're actually talking about working with other parts of DHS in the cyber protection world. We go to them and go, what should be the guidance? What should we be looking at funding? Where are the gaps at? So part of the funding is really driven by, in the federal family, the subject matter experts on those threats, and then we build that into the grant guidance to apply that. Our responsibility for response is twofold. One is to ensure our systems are protected, which we are working diligently on. I will be truthful in that we are not where we need to be, and so we are taking the corrective actions. But the other part is the consequence of the events. When you look at these types of threats, some of them may only be financial, some of them may only be disruptive, such as defacing a web page. But when you start impacting critical infrastructure and you start having impacts, we have to be able to respond literally as a no-notice event to the consequences when it exceeds state capability. So we're primarily in DHS the focus of what happens if something occurs and those disruptions that require outside assistance beyond the immediate response to the cyber threat itself. But also through the grants program, making sure that based upon the guidance from the experts within DHS that we have identified eligible projects and prioritize those, as well as making sure that our training programs are addressing these issues for the first responder community.
Thank you. Minister Fugate, the Secretary has been very outspoken about the need for budget reform to include the need to develop requirements across the department and translate those requirements to mission-based budgets, and I certainly support those efforts. How will FEMA define their specific requirements, and what are the challenges?
Well, again, we look at what does it require us to respond to catastrophic events with no notice. To start establishing, you'll never fund any one agency to do everything. So how do you build a team, and where do we make investments in funding to get to outcomes? But we tie not only, very typically you'll see in a document, you're going to go do something, respond to something, and nobody says, well, how much time is it going to take to get there? So we very much try to tie, what outcome are we trying to change by that response? How much will be required? And the fact that much of what FEMA does is not as the public generally thinks. We don't as necessarily respond as we help fund, support, and build teams, but that actually responds to state and locals. So we're trying to tie our assigned functions to those responsibilities in our budget to make direct connections between, and this has been a challenge, how do you know that you've invested in grants that are directly tied to outcomes that the nation's identified, such as how long should it take for an urban search and rescue team from the outside to arrive in your community when no notice events occur? Should it be 2 days, 3 days, 12 hours? So we've been basing upon, if you're going to get there and change an outcome, there are certain time hacks that we don't get to move because we can't get there any faster. And using that to start driving decisions. So we're working to better tie what is the outcome we need as a nation, not just to respond, but actually change the outcome. And are we building that capacity? And that goes back to the consolidation of grants. If you're going to drive very specific national capabilities, you're going to have to put more emphasis on building that across the nation. Not necessarily jurisdiction by jurisdiction, and hope it adds up.
Thank you. And how do you see your budget changing if the entire department goes to a unified budget structure that's tied to the mission?
I think it's things that we've already been laying groundwork on. I think one of the things that Secretary Johnson's bringing to the department is much better transparency between components on visibility of what other budget issues were. Previously, we would oftentimes submit our budget to the department and have passbacks with no visibility on what other agencies were facing. We would have things that would be assigned to us as something we're doing across all of DHS, but there wasn't a lot of visibility in that. And so both the Deputy Secretary and Secretary have made commitments that as we do our budgets, rather than each component as a little stovepipe coming up to DHS and not having visibility, we're going to look at more and give the components more visibility of what's going on. If we know the intent, we can make better budget decisions. And so I think this is an evolving process. We've been laying groundwork, and we are looking forward to working with the Secretary on how we do better budgeting within the department to make sure that we're best utilizing all of our capabilities across DHS versus each agency within DHS trying to figure out our role and responsibilities.
Thank you. And I'll, at this time, recognize the distinguished ranking member, Mr. Price.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Administrator, let me talk with you about the Emergency Food and Shelter Program and the plans in the budget to reduce funding for that program by $20 million, or 16.7%, while also transferring the funds and administrative responsibility for the program to the Department of Housing and Urban Development. I served on the old VA HUD and Independent Agency Subcommittee, which had jurisdiction at that point over both FEMA and HUD. And the transfer of this sort, a transfer of this sort, was first proposed, and it was rejected back in fiscal year 2003. I was serving on the Homeland Security after VA HUD was unfortunately disbanded. The transfer proposal was put forward, rejected again for fiscal 04, fiscal 05. So this isn't new. Now, my recollection is that the stakeholder groups were fairly unanimous back then that they didn't want that emergency food and shelter program to be transferred out of FEMA. And the reason was they were very happy with the way FEMA administered the program. Now, I have to say to you, I'm not sure they're as happy now. There are some complaints, which I'm sure you're aware of. One of the virtues of FEMA administration was the rapid, relatively hassle-free distribution of funds. That isn't quite as often said now. There were, as I understand it, delayed distribution of funds during fiscal 12, something like 9 months taken to begin distributing the EFS assistant. That's nearly double the amount of time directed in the authorizing legislation, the McKinney-Vento Homeless Assistance Act. I think the fiscal 2013 awards were also delayed in distribution. The reason for keeping it in FEMA was to keep the identity of the program, directly reaching more suburban and rural areas than most HUD programs, with a retention of local decision-making. Some of those strengths remain, I suppose, but again, the way the program's been dragged out, and there are new programming requirements, reporting requirements from the DHS FEMA Grants Office. There's reduced staffing, I think. You can maybe confirm this. Only a single staff person now. There used to be three people. I don't know what the staffing levels are exactly, but some are even suggesting that there's a kind of unwelcoming attitude at FEMA about this program, maybe an attempt to go ahead and shove the program out. So the stakeholders aren't as happy now, but then again, the move to HUD isn't exactly being embraced either. So we need to get this right. I wonder what the basic rationale is for moving the program over to HUD. To what extent you think that would be a better alignment of the program's mission? Is the current transfer proposal premised on any kind of outreach to stakeholders or input from stakeholders? Are you going to conduct such outreach? Is this, you think, a desirable change from their point of view? Maybe the landscape's changed here. I mean, just help us understand the rationale for this proposal and give us an honest assessment of whether this is a good idea.
Again, Congress has asked all the agencies to really define your mission and make sure that you're doing the things your mission says. The Emergency Food and Shelter Program was in FEMA when I got there. Congressman Price, if there's any, if I know of any attempt not to administer this program as a prelude to forcing it out, I'll deal with that. That's not the intent. But this is about pre-existing community conditions. This is about homelessness. This is about feeding the hungry. Although FEMA does those things after a disaster, that's not one of our responsibilities and part of our mission. It's something that's added on there. These are programs that are more in line with HUD's community programs to deal with pre-existing conditions. So it's an attempt to realign programs that for whatever reason ended up in our portfolio that's not our core mission. And even though I know some of the grantees have had good relationships with FEMA, we've also had to increase our oversight of those grants based upon IG findings to ensure that we have proper accounting and appropriate controls for those funds. And some groups are having to adapt to that. That's a change. Change sometimes is difficult. But Congressman, when you really look at FEMA, this is about pre-existing conditions. This is about homelessness, and this is about feeding the hungry. As much as I think this is an important thing for the federal government to look to do, this is not inherently what FEMA was built to do. And so the question is it better to be at HUD or at FEMA? The one thing I will tell you if it is at FEMA, I will ensure that it's run effectively. And again, we have had to improve our oversight of those grants because of IG findings of irregularities or lack of documentation. So I don't want to say that there haven't been changes, but it's not the intention that I'm trying to make the program run so poorly that you're forced to move it. My job is to take the appropriations and implement it. But it does not look like this is what my overall mission space requires us to do. It's not part of what our core expertise is, but if we're funded to do it, we're going to do it.
I appreciate that determination. I wonder if you have any comment on the on these delays in distributing funds, on the staffing levels. Are there problems there that you think need to be corrected?
I'll take that back and take a look at it, sir. I'm not aware of that specifically, so it's something I need to go back and find out what's going on. I can tell you, though, that we've had staff reductions in the last couple of years based upon our budget where we've reduced our permanent workforce. So, again, I would have to go back and get why reductions were made. Are those adequate to carry out the mission, and what the delays were and what those causes, and I'll provide that back to you, sir.
Thank you. That would be helpful, and anything else that will help us on this decision. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Price. At this time, I recognize gentleman, Mr. Fleischman.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Administrator, in January 2013, President Obama signed into law the Sandy Recovery Improvement Act. One of the goals of this legislation was to reduce the amount of red tape communities need to go through after a disaster to begin rebuilding, as well as speed up the recovery process and save the federal government money. All good goals and goals we need to strive towards. One of the law's provisions created greater flexibility within the public assistance program. FEMA has implemented a pilot program known as the Public Assistance Alternative Procedures. Can you please provide the subcommittee with an update on how this pilot program is going, sir?
We're moving along and implementing it. Again, under the pilot, we have very large projects that are going through the obligation process currently as a result of Hurricane Sandy. The gist of it is, prior to the change in that, we could only refund actual cost. That meant that project management took a long time. So an example in your district, if you had a fire station that wasn't insured and it was destroyed, rather than just getting an estimate of what it would take to replace that fire station and then issuing the grant for the community to rebuild that fire station, we would go through every plan change, every design change, and we would only reimburse them as work was done. We'd have to send inspectors out to make sure the rebar was actually being used and that any cost associated with the project were what was priorly approved. Very bureaucratic, very slow. Again, the goal here is to make sure due diligence of the people's money, actual cost. By giving us the ability to do an estimate, we can agree to, and this isn't hard to do, insurance companies do it every day, governments do it every day when they put a bid out to build a fire station. If it was destroyed and ineligible, why can't we do the similar process? Let's get a bid for that fire station, replace it, let's agree upon that, let's write the grant, let's pay it, allow the community to build that fire station. If they want to move it somewhere, not penalize them, it may make sense to move it. Our previous program would not always agree to that. So this is really about not increasing eligibility, but speeding up that process to ensure that those eligible projects are fully funded to an agreed amount, that they can move forward with that based upon an estimate versus actual cost.
Thank you, sir. Can you approximate how many public assistance applicants have taken advantage of this alternative?
The number's changing. Initially, there was some concern. It was a new program. We have several very large projects. As far as dollar figures go, those dollar figures in the projects that are currently being approved will be in the billions of dollars. Total number of applicants, I'll get to you. It will not be the largest number because these are for projects over $1 million and they tend to be the large complex projects. But you will see that the dollar figure associated with the alternative projects, particularly in New York, there's going to be some very large projects coming through the system that when we do our notifications, you'll see that those move through the $1 million queue for notification to Congress. And that will be an indicator that we have reached the agreement, finalized that, and are waiting the final clearance to authorize to make those payments. And that is occurring as we are speaking. This process is moving.
Okay, so you would say not many applicants, but on larger dollar projects, so it would be a lot of dollars involved.
We have small projects, thresholds, and we have our normal program, and then we establish $1 million for these larger projects. And the tendency, the advantage to the applicant is the more complex the project is, the better the estimating works. But part of this was educating our grantees, getting them comfortable with this so that they felt that they were actually getting what they needed. There was some concern by using estimates. Well, what if there was additional cost identified later? What if they didn't have the actual cost, if they ended up being short on that? I think there's much more confidence in the system we're presenting that those answers we do on the front end with subject matter experts to ensure that that project is fully funded.
What impediments have you run into in this program in regard to its implementation?
Well, it's new, and there's always the concern, and this is, as a state person, I'd have the same concern. What if I agree to a project and then discover eligible damages later? Would I not be able to get that funded? If I'm doing actual cost, I can. But that's why we say, look, we're not just basing this upon any estimate. We want to have licensed engineers, licensed architect, people of record, just like you'd go bid for a contract. Once you bid for that contract, putting your seal on it, you own it. So you want to make sure you do your due diligence on the front end. That's why we're taking those steps to ensure that we get that due diligence. But just like any other bid a company accepts, once you accept the bid, it's binding. So we want to make sure we do the work on the front end to get that to that project, but then provide the freedom to the applicant once that agreement is reached. You want to change the color of the paint on the walls, FEMA should not have to have a sign off on that. You want to move the station 5 foot one direction, we shouldn't sign off on that. If you decide you need to build a fire station bigger, shouldn't require another sign off because we've already approved what was eligible and you're able to go forward and get it built and get that fire station back in that community.
Thank you, sir. Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Fleischman. This time I recognize the gentlelady from California, Ms. Roy Allard.
Mr. Fugate, first of all, let me thank you for the 2014 UWASI grant allocation to Los Angeles. I understand that my colleague, Congresswoman Lowy, already asked about the criteria that you used in selecting which cities would be eligible for UWASI grants. I would be interested also in knowing the formula that you used in actually allocating money to the cities in the program. Can you elaborate on that or maybe submit it for the record?
Parts of it we can submit for the record, and part of it I can provide a brief. Part of it does involve intelligence information that's factored into developing the threat stream. But what we do is we have been using a formula base of risk that uses everything from populations, critical infrastructure, vulnerabilities, as well as known threats, intelligence that may suggest or have information about how communities have been described by potential adversaries, and then we rank them. The question that I've been asked is, well, how did we go from 25 to 39? When we did the formulas, and you gave us 25, we went down that list, and when you got 25, we cut it off. But the difference between 25 and 26 were negligible, but you had gave us a hard 25. When you run these formulas, and again, we don't design the formulas to limit it only to 15 cities. We run these formulas, and what we found is there are certain groupings. The top tiers very obviously stand alone. Once you get in about the middle, there's not much separating. And so now the distinction of which of these fall off or fall in, and because the grouping is very similar, there's no clean, obvious break. So we used what breaks you did see in those models. And we made a decision. We made a recommendation to the Secretary. The cities that were funded, many of them had been urban security areas prior to that, had dropped off the list when 25 didn't qualify. But when you ran the current formulas, they were still ranking higher. And again, we were charged with looking at the 100 metropolitan areas to always evaluate and continue to evaluate the risk and the threat. And using these formulas, we got down to the grouping, about 39, all fell within certain ranges. So we made a conscious decision to fund the higher tiers at much higher levels. As we got down to the bottom where there was no clean distinction, we gave one group an average of $3 million and the next group was $1 million. More to sustain their capabilities, but there wasn't that clean distinction that said you're stopping here. It would be, again, showing you the formulas and showing those breakouts. If you give me a hard number, I run the same formula, and if it says 20, it stops at 20, and no matter what the difference is between 21 and 20. But by running the formula, it's not giving us a hard cap. We found that in grouping, there's not enough distinction really to call out and say it's easy, 25 and you can stop. 25, 26, not that much difference. 26 to 30, 30 to 39, they're very much grouped in and very similar scores in that. So if we wanted to design something that said, okay, we only want to fund a certain amount, then if you gave us a hard number and we look at the formula factors, that's where it would stop. But that was the rationale. Again, I know they're concerned that that list grew, but it's because once you move into the middle, there's not clear distinctions, and you had very common issues across those that we made the decision to provide some funding to continue previous work.
Okay. So you'll submit anything additional?
Yes.
Okay, thank you.
I don't believe the ranking member has any additional questions at this time. Administrator Fugate, thank you for that very thorough presentation. That's deeply appreciated. I think we've reached the point in time of this hearing where we're drinking our own bathwater, so I think this is an appropriate time to adjourn. Thank you very much.